In the spring of 1943, a B-24 Liberator called the Lady Be Good took off from a desert airstrip in Libya. 9 men. First combat mission together. It never came back. The official verdict was what it always was when a plane disappeared over the Mediterranean: lost at sea. But here's what nobody knew at the time. The plane wasn't in the sea at all. It was in the Sahara Desert, 440 miles south of where those men had taken off. Sitting in the sand. Guns still loaded. Radio still working. And a thermos of tea inside, still drinkable, 16 years later. And its crew had jumped out into the dark, into the desert, in the middle of the night, miles from anything, miles from anyone. This is the story of the Lady Be Good. It was April 4th, 1943, and I want you to understand something important about this crew before we go any further. They had never done this before. I'm talking about 9 men. A pilot, a co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunners, and a radio operator who had only arrived at Solok Field in Libya 18 days earlier. The Lady Be Good herself had only been assigned to their squadron 10 days before that. And on that afternoon, they were about to fly their very first combat mission together. The plan was straightforward, at least on paper. 25 B-24 Liberators from the 376th Bombardment Group would take off in waves, form up over the Mediterranean, and bomb the port at Naples. It would be about a 1,000-mile round trip. The Lady Be Good was among the last to depart. Wheels up at 2:15 in the afternoon. And almost immediately, things started going wrong. A sandstorm rolled across the desert. Visibility dropped immediately. 8 of the 25 B-24s turned around and went home. But not the Lady Be Good. She kept flying north. Strong tailwinds had pushed the formation faster than expected. She arrived over Naples at 7:50 in the evening, 25,000 feet up. But poor visibility obscured the primary target. The Lady Be Good's crew released their bombs into the Mediterranean to reduce weight and save fuel. And then they pointed south, back towards Libya, back towards Solok, back toward home. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The return flight should have taken a few hours. But somewhere over the dark Mediterranean, something went wrong with the aircraft's automatic direction finder, the navigation equipment that was supposed to guide them home. It simply stopped working. At 12:12 in the morning, pilot Lieutenant William Hatton radioed Solok Field. He asked for a position bearing. He needed to know exactly where they were. The radio station answered immediately. They gave him a bearing. And this is where the story takes a turn that is genuinely painful to sit with. even 80 years later. You see, the navigator, a young lieutenant named Hayes, also on his very first combat mission, appears to have read that bearing 180 degrees backwards. It was a reciprocal reading error. You see, instead of understanding that they had already overflown their base and needed to reverse course immediately, the crew believed they were still north of Solok, still over the sea. So they kept flying south. The base at Solok, however, was right below them. Ground crews saw them coming and began firing flares to bring them in. However, the Lady Be Good flew right past and kept going, deeper into North Africa, deeper into the Sahara, for another 2 hours. Finally, at 2 a.m, with the fuel gauges reading empty, Lieutenant Hatton gave the order. All 9 men clipped on their parachutes and jumped into the dark, into the desert, 440 miles from where they'd taken off. And the Lady Be Good, unmanned and still under power, kept flying. A man without water in April heat can walk about 25 miles before his body gives out. Lieutenant Robert Toner's diary, which I'll come back to in a moment, tells us that 8 of the 9 men who survived the jump regrouped in the pre-dawn darkness. The 9th crew member, Bombardier John Warovka, never joined them. Apparently, his parachute didn't open fully. He was already gone. The 8 survivors had one shared resource between them: half a canteen of water. So they started walking north. Now I'm talking about 8 men crossing a featureless sand plain in the Sahara Desert. Midday temperatures reaching somewhere around 130 degrees Fahrenheit, no shade, no landmarks, nothing but the direction of north on a handheld compass, and the belief that someone, somewhere, was looking for them. As they walked, they left a trail. Arrowheads cut from parachute cloth and weighted down with stones, pointing north, just in case a search plane might pass overhead. But because rescue teams had been searching the Mediterranean, because everyone assumed the Lady Be Good was at the bottom of the sea, no one was looking in the desert. The downed B-24 crew walked for 8 days. They covered 85 miles. And at some point, 3 of the men, Sergeants Shelley, Moore, and Ripslinger, separated from the group and pushed further north in search of help. The remaining 5, Hatton, Toner, Hayes, Adams, and Lamott, stopped. They were simply too exhausted to go on, so they waited. Help never came. Desert survival experts, when told of this story decades later, called that 85-mile march superhuman. And I think that's probably the right word. When investigators eventually found the remains of those 5 men, which was in February of 1960, they found something among their belongings: a diary. It belonged to Lieutenant Robert F. Toner, who was the co-pilot from North Attleboro, Massachusetts, just 23 years old at the time. The entries into his diary ran from April 5th through April 12th, 1943, covering those 8 days. The early entries have detail in them. He writes about the bailout, about regrouping in the dark, about deciding to walk north. The later entries, however, grew shorter, fewer words, and the final entries are barely legible. He doesn't describe despair. He doesn't write about giving up. What comes through, even across 8 decades, is a group of men doing exactly what they were trained to do, moving when they could, leaving markers, until they simply couldn't anymore.
Lieutenant Toner's diary is one of the most quietly devastating artifacts of World War II, not because of what it describes, but because of how it ends. Now, I want to go back to the plane, because the Lady Be Good had her own story.
You see, when the crew bailed out, the aircraft didn't spiral. It didn't explode. It just kept going, gradually losing altitude in a long, shallow descent, with one engine still running, until it reached the flat desert floor of the Colancio Sand Sea and bellied in. It skidded 700 yards before breaking in two just behind the main wing. And then nothing. Just silence and sand. For 15 years. In May 1958, a crew aboard a survey aircraft spotted wreckage below them in the Libyan desert. Military hardware from the war was scattered all over North Africa, so it didn't raise immediate alarm. They simply marked the location on a map and flew on. The following year, a ground team from British Petroleum reached the site on foot. Oil surveyor Gordon Bowerman walked up to this bomber that had been sitting in the desert since 1943 and started cataloging what he found. The machine guns were still in place, still functional. In fact, investigators would later fire one simply by pulling the trigger. He also found survival rations and personal items bearing crew names, including the navigator's logbook still on board the plane. And most curious of all, a thermos of tea, which was still drinkable 15 years later. Bowerman wrote a letter to a friend of his, a lieutenant colonel at Wheelus Air Force Base in Libya. That letter changed everything. By May 1959, 16 years after the Lady Be Good vanished from the official record, military investigators were finally standing at her crash site, beginning to understand what had actually happened on that April night. The first search for the crew, which took place May through August of 1959, found nothing but trail markers and a flight boot purposefully placed atop an aluminum antenna strut. It was a haunting reminder of why the crew left it behind. It wasn't until February of 1960 that another British Petroleum survey crew, working deep inside the Colancio Sand Sea, came across a plateau where 5 men had stopped walking. Those 5 men, of course, were Hatton, Toner, Hayes, Adams and Lamont. Their personal effects were found around them, including Toner's diary. A joint Army-Air Force operation called Operation Climax launched shortly afterwards. It had eventually found Shelley's remains 38 kilometers northwest, and Ripslinger's 42 kilometers beyond that. Sergeant Ripslinger had walked more than 200 miles from where the Lady Be Good crashed. Staff Sergeant Vernon Moore was never found. Lieutenant Warovka was recovered near the original crash site. 8 of the 9 men were eventually brought home, just not the way anyone had hoped. As for the plane, parts of her were salvaged after 1959 and installed in aircraft still in service. And this is where the story picks up one final thread. Several of those aircraft later suffered accidents or unexplained losses. Whether that's coincidence, I'll leave that for you to decide. The bulk of the wreck was removed from the desert in 1994. Some pieces are now on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. A small corner of that museum, dedicated to a plane that flew itself 440 miles into the Sahara and landed. The Lady Be Good disappeared because of a compass bearing read 180 degrees backwards. And 9 men were 440 miles from home in the dark. I think about the arrowheads cut from parachutes. 8 men, exhausted and running out of water, who still stopped to cut up their chutes and arrange them into markers pointing north, because they believed someone would eventually see them. Unfortunately, they were wrong about the search, but not about their instincts and their training. You see, those markers sat in the desert for 16 years, until a geologist with an oil company happened to walk past. The Lady Be Good doesn't fit cleanly into the victory narrative of World War II. There's no rescue. There wasn't even a search. What there is an 8-day diary that runs out of words. A trail of parachute cloth in the sand. And a plane that flew itself further into the desert than any of its crew ever got. But because someone wrote a letter, because an oil surveyor thought to mention what he'd found, because investigators kept going back, the remains of these men were found. Their names were recovered. Their 8 days of survival was finally told. And that's the part of this story that anyone rarely talks about.
The disappearance of the B-24 Lady Be Good. It combines everything that fascinates us. Iconic World War II planes, an unsolved aviation mystery, the discovery of an untouched aircraft wreck years later, and finally, the search for that missing crew. Now, if you want more stories like this one, the ones the history books leave out, then I hope you'll consider subscribing and staying right here, because we got a lot more of them.